Who want to either a clarification on one specific point or address specific points regarding all those difficult field of investigation?
You know, from a layman's perspective, this issue of bias coming into the reporting, when someone's undertaking some research of this kind, really, because there's so many uncertainties, if they go in with a view or a perspective and they want to come out with a result, it is going to have some impact, isn't it, potentially on how they look at the data. Is that what you're saying? There's an inherent danger that the bias comes in and then you sort of, you know, interprets the results accordingly.
Yeah, well, the issue of bias, I think, is a, I would say, double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's important to acknowledge the possibility of bias and to address their, and at least, you know, if one bias cannot be prevented, at least, you know, to acknowledge that, you know, this may operate. On the other hand, there is a tendency sometimes to overstate the role of bias and say, well, we can't believe anything in epidemiology because whatever we found, whether it's positive or negative, in any case is due to bias, which may or may not be the case. And there are ways to look at the data carefully and to understand likelihood, magnitude, and direction of bias. And sometimes it's clear that, you know, the data are so poorly collected and so poorly analyzed that, you know, it's very likely that bias is there. Other times it seems less likely, you know, so that's part of the way, the right way is to look carefully at the specific situation and try to understand how much is likely to operate there.
Let me start in the way. Look, this kind of diseases are full of emotions, and then only a toxicologist can be a little bit stand back and say, take care. Nevertheless, if my child has cancer and somebody tells me I was connected with pesticide and that's the reason for it, I will believe that immediately in that moment. Now you tell us, look, of a lot of these studies, epidemiology studies, they have their weaknesses, don't trust them anyway. But on the other side, we cannot go and say, no, it is nothing. And as well, our key messages will not help in a sense, look, we test all these active ingredients. What can we do? What shall we do? What is needed to do to get a more convincing argumentation, convincing argument to all this kind of bad messages around the pesticides?
Well, I'm not sure I have the answer, but I can try to say a few things. Well, first of all, I didn't say that really epidemiology is useless. In fact, it's been, because I would go out of business, you know, right away. But I think that I was trying to convey the idea that, you know, epidemiology has weaknesses, and it's important to address these weaknesses and understand them. And sometimes the weaknesses are so overwhelming that we can't really reach any conclusion. Many times, you know, we can help. We can at least have part of the picture put together. Then, second aspect is obviously there is a need to integrate epidemiology and toxicology data, but the bottom line, I think, is that it's important, I think, for your constituency to be able to interpret epidemiology correctly, to be able to really understand which studies are strong, which studies are weak and can be sort of easily dismissed, etc. And this will enable you also, you or any other stakeholder. I mean, I would do exactly the same sort of, you know, discourse to you know, NGO, whatever. I mean, really to enable you to go to the, as close as possible to the hard evidence in terms of, you know, defending certain conclusions versus other conclusions. I mean, sometimes the results may not be what you like, but, you know, they may be very strong. Other times, you know, the results maybe are what you like, but they are very weak. It is important for you to understand how strong or weak they are, independent of, you know, what they say. How to achieve this, and whether this is possible to represent, whether this may represent a common ground, you know, for sort of the discussion with possible social or political counterpart or whatever. That's something that, you know, may happen in the future. I don't know.
Paul, you had the opportunity this morning. If we have time, you will get it, but our friend, go ahead.
Johannes Hall from the Industry Association, Finland. About 30 years ago, Lennart Hardell in Sweden carried out a study amongst farmers and people who were using phenoxys or chlorinated phenols. and studied the connection between soft tissue sarcomas to this, yes, to this within this group of people, those who were using phenoxys or phenols, chlorinated phenols. And I learned of that study that the likeliness to get statistically valuable data depends also how common that type of disease, that type of cancer is. When it comes to more common, let's say more frequent types of cancers, the probability, statistical probability is lower. Nowadays, I understand that very much of connection, or let's say ability to get cancer, depends on genetic variation, genetic characteristics of the people. Do you expect that this is a constant in this, or are these expected as constant amongst the people, this factor?
Yeah.
Or how it is it?
Yeah, well, no, I think you're touching on two different issues. One is the rare cancer issue, and with the example of soft tissue sarcoma, and this goes back to something I try to address, that, you know, rare events like rare cancers lead to small studies, and these small studies tend to be more easily false positive or false negative. They have a lower statistical power. If you can do a very large study of a rare cancer by including huge population, that's fine. Then it will no longer be a rare in a way. Genetic is important, but on the population level explains only a small proportion of cancer if we talk about cancer. There are now a lot of studies trying to understand whether susceptibility, genetic inherited susceptibility may vary, by individuals, and therefore people may be at different level of risk given the same exposure. So some people may be at higher risk of cancer, say, because of a given exposure, compared to others because of genetic variability. Regarding the group of researchers that you mentioned at the beginning from Sweden, most of their results have not been confirmed by other groups, so now they are no longer very strongly regarded as important.
One question. Is it possible to get a quick reading on any particular study as it breaks in the news, in terms of the profession's attitude towards that study?
Well, yes, but it is possible to review one individual study, but I think that very often this has to be put in the broader context, you know, of the existing epidemiological or toxicological or whatever evidence. And this may, so to have a full picture, going back to the criteria for causality that I mentioned, one can evaluate that individual study, that particular result, but then it's important to try to put it in the broader scheme, I think.
Further to that, is it possible for, this is a complex issue, do you have any thoughts on developing the sector's skill in handling this issue?
Well, yeah, no, I think this is a very important question, in fact. And going back also to your question, I think that is important for your sector to be able really to deal with these issues and not to be always, you know, on the defensive side and being attacked, etc. And developing the skill in interpreting epidemiological studies, both on individual study-by-study basis, but also broader, you know, to put it in the broader context of toxicology, etc., and regulatory issues is an important thing. I have now some experience of developing this sort of skill with another industry, which is the food industry, which has similar issues, as you can imagine, because there are media reports of this and that causing this other disease every day, you know, or whatever. And again, they have confronted with the same issue. So we develop a training program for their senior technical staff, you know, really to understand, to go into more detail and understand what are the real weaknesses and strengths of epidemiology and how to interpret and how to weight the evidence, I think.